So this is the Ayn Loki Max, and it's also one of the smallest 6800U Windows Handheld PCs out there right now. The GPD Win 4 and the Neo Air are probably the only devices smaller than the Loki Max, and for me personally, it's still the smallest Windows PC that I've used. Now, I've had it on pre-order for so long I almost forgot they were still making them. There's already so many new entries into the handheld market with the newer 7840U processor that this almost feels obsolete. In this video, I'll be sharing my initial experience with the Loki Max, going over hardware, software, and gameplay performance tests. I'll also be slightly comparing gameplay performance on it to a device with the current gen 7840U processor. The Loki Max came packaged nicely inside a black box with a 65-watt detachable USB-C charger, a made-to-fit carrying bag, and a screen protector. I decided not to install the screen protector as most times I prefer not to use one to avoid interfering with the quality of the display. Inside the box there was also a thank you note from Ayn for supporting the Odin Pro, which was the first product I bought from the company a few years ago. It's an Android based handheld which has surprisingly held its own since I've had it. I pretty much only use it for retro games nowadays since there's a lot more powerful handhelds out there right now. Anyway, let's check out the Loki Max's hardware. First off, you can get it in either a white or a black color, but I chose to get mine in white. The first thing that hit me when I took it out the box is the fact that it weighs so little and that the entire device itself is really small and compact. It's definitely the smallest Windows handheld PC that I've used to date, especially when compared to common devices like the Steam Deck or even the ROG Ally. I feel like this build would be perfect for people with small hands. For people with large hands, this might be a struggle to use, especially for long periods of time. As for controls, it uses the common Xbox controller layout you'll see on a lot of Windows handhelds these days. There's two alternating joysticks which are also small sized like what you'd find on the Switch. I find that they're actually perfect for ergonomics on a small handheld like the Loki Max. Unfortunately, these aren't Hall effect joysticks. On the right side of the screen, there's also ABXY buttons, an in-game menu button, and a button for quickly pulling up the Loki Control Center software. On the left side, there's a 4-direction D-pad, another in-game menu button, and a button for quickly pulling up the Xbox game bar at any point in time. There's also two speakers positioned below on opposite sides of the screen, but do not expect mind-blowing sound quality from them. You might want to consider using a dedicated external device like Bluetooth earbuds with the Loki Max for a better audio experience. The Loki Max comes equipped with a 6-inch LCD IPS touchscreen display surrounded by some average-sized bezels. The fact that those bezels are the same color as the console makes them blend in very nicely, almost creating the illusion of a bezel-less design. The screen has a maximum resolution of 1080p, a maximum refresh rate of 60 Hz, and up to a maximum of 400 nits of brightness. In comparison, the Ally can get a bit brighter at up to 500 nits, while the Steam Deck also maxes out at 400 nits. Moving on to the top side of the console, there's the left and a right shoulder buttons as well as Hall effect triggers, which means longer lifespan. There's also a volume rocker, a power button, and an outlet vent on the top of the console there. Underneath the console, there's an SD card slot, a 3.5mm audio jack for wired headsets, and a single USB Type-C 4.0 port for both charging and data transfer. Honestly, I wish there was more USB-C ports on the device, but that's what you get with the Loki Max. On the back side of the console, there's two customizable back grip buttons that kind of feel uncomfortable to use as far as I'm concerned. There's also an inlet air vent on the back there that pairs with the one on the top for a single fan cooling system which the Loki Max uses. The left and right grips do have an ergonomic shape and feel to them, but keep in mind that people with large hands might find it a bit too small for them. The controller also comes with gyroscope support for anyone who plans on using that. As for lighting, there's a decent amount on the Loki Max. First off, there's an A logo that lights up on the backside. Then there's RGB LEDs below the joysticks and also along the sides of the console, which can be customized through the Loki Control Center software. Now, like many other handhelds, the Loki Max also runs off Windows 11. That means access to all the different game services one could ever want. You can download and play games from your Steam or your Game Pass library easily on the Loki Max. If you already own a game on Steam, you can just download it directly onto the handheld without having to buy it again. You also gain access to Steam's cloud for saving your games across multiple platforms. Windows 11 OS also comes with problems, and If you have any experience gaming on Windows, then these problems shouldn't be very new to you. Expect to do updates to the Loki Max on an ongoing basis like you'd expect to do with any PC. Make sure to do all the Windows and AMD driver updates the first time you turn on the device for a smooth and problem-free operation. You'll also have to keep an eye on these updates to make sure the console does not begin to underperform at any point in time. The Loki Max doesn't come equipped with its own game launcher like we're starting to see with a lot of handhelds now. On Steam, there's Big Picture mode, which works really well for a top-notch handheld gaming experience, so I decided to use that on the Loki Max as well. Now keep in mind that the system still runs on Windows 11 with the Steam software just running in Steam's handheld mode for a more user-friendly handheld experience on the Loki Max. Every game that's been purchased on Steam are all automatically accessible through the Steam Game Launcher. It's also super easy to add non-Steam games using the manual process of searching for the game and then adding your own thumbnail and cover photo. I found that Big Picture mode looks great and works really well for using the Loki Max in handheld mode. Something else I've noticed on every Windows handheld I've come across is that they usually have some kind of quick settings menu for controlling various things related to performance. The Loki Max uses LCC, which is a control center for fine-tuning performance on the console, amongst a bunch of other things. There's the TDP limit for controlling the level of performance on the device, CPU and GPU controls, automatic and manual fan controls, RGB settings, volume and brightness controls, and a lot more. It's super important to understand how TDP works in order to maximize the balance between performance and battery life while playing any games on any Windows handheld. The Loki Max goes from 4 to 34 watts TDP in stepwise manner. I'm sure that with a third-party program you can exceed that 34 watts TDP. At lower TDPs, expect a much weaker performance, but battery life also lasts a lot longer. At higher numbers, there's much better performance, but the battery life also takes a much harder hit. Now, let's talk about the specs. The Loki Max is powered by AMD's Ryzen 7 6800U processor, which also means AMD's Radeon 680M iGPU for graphics. It also comes equipped with 16GB of DDR5 RAM, 512GB of M.2 SSD storage, and a 46.2 watt-hour battery. There's no higher configurations of the console on their website, but there are other models with weaker processors for anyone who's wondering. They do sell at a lower price than the Loki Max as well. The RAM should be more than enough for gaming purposes, but for multitasking, a higher RAM will probably be needed. As for the storage, the default amount is not very much and will probably get filled up with only a few games. It also doesn't use the more common 2280 style M.2 SSDs that more people will probably have access to. It uses a 2242 style M.2 SSD, which honestly, this is the first device I've come across that uses that. Another alternative to increasing storage is by using an SD card on the Loki Max. Battery life on it isn't that much better than a lot of other handhelds out there right now, but for its size, it's nice to have a larger battery than both the Steam Deck and the Ally. With proper battery management, one can squeeze a good amount of battery time out of it. Keep in mind that this depends on a variety of factors like the type of game being played, TDP limit, resolution, and a lot more. Speaking of games, let's check out some gameplay performance on the Loki Max. First, I tried out Mafia Definitive Edition. After launching the game, I set the graphics to the lowest preset and started at 1080p with TDP set to 30 watts. The graphics looked great on that 6-inch display and the game was running about 30 frames per second consistently, sometimes even going about 40. I lowered the TDP to 20 watts and as expected, I started getting FPS numbers below 30, which wasn't very visually appealing to say the least. I went ahead and lowered the resolution while still keeping that TDP set to 20 watts and I was back to getting numbers above 30 consistently again. Finally, I increased the TDP to 25 watts and then started averaging 45 plus frames per second, making the game run really well. The next game I tried was Middle-earth: Shadow of War. To start here, I set the TDP to 30 watts again, launched the game, and then set the graphics preset to the lowest while playing at 1080p. The graphics looked great once again and I was pretty much getting close to 60 frames per second consistently. I lowered the TDP to 15 watts further at the same resolution and graphics presets and was getting numbers below 30 frames per second, which made the game unplayable. Finally, I lowered the resolution to 720p, keeping the TDP at 15 watts, and then began averaging 40 plus frames per second again. Now, these settings will be ideal for maximizing battery time while maintaining performance playing a game like this one. Don't forget that you can always use AMD's FSR to upscale resolution when playing at 720p. Some games have it built in, but for those that don't have it built in, you can always enable it through AMD's Adrenalin software. Assassin's Creed Origins was next up, and if you know anything about this franchise, you'll know these games tend to be a bit more graphics intensive than most others. As usual, I started off at the native 1080p resolution and the lowest graphics preset here. I then set the TDP limit to 30 watts and was able to average some pretty high FPS numbers close to that sweet 60 mark. The game looked really good and ran buttery smooth, but the battery drain was also much faster. I lowered the TDP to 15 watts, still at 1080p, and now I was getting numbers in the mid 30s with some drops below 30. Finally, I lowered the resolution to 720p, still at 15 watts, and was now able to average high 40 frames per second, sometimes even getting into the 50s. The next game I played was Cyberpunk 2077. For this game, I decided to compare performance alongside the ROG Ally, which uses the next generation of the 6800U AMD processor. To start here, I set the TDP on the Ally to the 30 watt max while connected to power, and then played the game at the lowest graphics settings at 1080p resolution. I was able to get 50 plus frames per second on average with the Ally, but with some occasional dips below 50. On the Loki Max, I did the same thing and set the TDP to 30 watts plugged in with resolution set to 1080p and graphics preset at the lowest. I was able to average mid to high 40 frames per second with occasional jumps into the 50s, which to be frank was pretty solid in comparison to the Ally. I lowered that TDP limit to 25 watts on the Loki Max and was still averaging low to mid 40 frames per second. On the Ally at 25 watts, I was averaging mid to high 40s. Next, I lowered the TDP limit on the Loki Max to 15 watts and was now getting 30 plus frames per second with the occasional dip below that. On the Ally at the same TDP, I was averaging very similar numbers with the occasional dips below 30 as well. Finally, I increased the TDP limit to 30 watts on the Loki Max, but this time lowering the resolution to 720p and was able to average 60 frames per second consistently with some slight dips below that. Now on the Ally with the same settings, I was averaging 60 plus frames per second, which was only a slight bit better to be honest. But if you want more frames, then you definitely want to play on a screen that has a higher refresh rate like on the Ally. Now, based on these tests, I'd say currently there's not much difference in terms of gameplay performance between the Ally and the Loki Max. Now, keep in mind that updates to the Ryzen Z1 Extreme chip inside the Ally could still lead to a much better performance over the Loki Max. The last game I tried out was FIFA 23. Now, I set the TDP to 30 watts at 1080p with the lowest graphics preset and was able to consistently get 60 frames per second during gameplay, but as with every handheld I've played FIFA 23 on, there were lots of stutters during cutscenes where FPS numbers usually dropped below 30. At 20 watts, I was still getting a consistent 60 frames per second for very nice and smooth gameplay. I lowered the TDP to 15 watts, still at 1080p, and was now averaging around 45 to 50 frames per second during gameplay, with cutscenes remaining the same throughout. I decided not to play at a lower resolution since the game ran great at 1080p, even at lower TDP limits. Here's what a sports game like FIFA with small characters would look like on a 6-inch versus a 7 and an 8.4-inch display. To be honest, I feel like it looks and plays so much better on a larger screen than on a small screen. Of course, this would ultimately still come down to preference, but I just thought I'd show the difference in screen size while playing this game to you guys in this video. The performance of FIFA 23 was also very similar between all three devices. The OXP2 and the Loki Max use the same previous gen 6800U processor, while the Ally uses a modified version of the current gen 7840U processor. The Loki Max also comes equipped with the latest in Wi-Fi technology, which is great for both remote play and cloud gaming. Keep in mind that Wi-Fi 6E also requires a solid Wi-Fi router and internet service for the maximum benefits. I put the Wi-Fi tech to the test by trying Xbox Cloud Gaming on the Loki Max. I had it connected to a Wi-Fi 6 router and was able to get a consistent, lag-free gameplay regardless of what games I played. Of course, this is not going to be the same experience for everyone, and I definitely wouldn't suggest cloud gaming for games that depend highly on low latency, like first-person shooters for example. I found that it's usually best used for story-driven games where latency isn't always top priority. Besides having Wi-Fi 6E, the Loki Max also comes equipped with Bluetooth 5.2 for connecting different Bluetooth-enabled external devices without any issues at all. At the end of the day, I'm sure the Loki Max wouldn't appeal to everyone, but for anyone who prefers a powerful handheld with a small form factor and a small screen, it's definitely worth checking out. There are already handhelds with the current gen more powerful AMD 7840U processor, but 6800U handhelds like the Loki Max or even the OXP2 are still very capable. Some of the main reasons to avoid the Loki Max are the fact that it runs off an older generation processor, the lack of multiple USB-C ports, or if you have large hands, the size and ergonomics could also be a problem. Anyway, that's all I've got for you guys on the Loki Max for now. I hope this video has provided some useful insights into it. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you all in my next video. It's Tommy, and I'm out, y'all.